Copyright in these lectures is either owned by the ANU or a third party who has licensed the ANU to use it. Students may use the recording for personal study only. No lecture may be communicated online, copied or shared without the prior permission of the ANU.
Alright guys, let's get started. So last week was, there was no class, but the topic of last week was professional evidence, right? We started looking at different sources of evidence. We started with professional evidence. Professional sources of information that can be used to garner evidence about any particular subject. And today we're going to look at another source of evidence, which is scientific evidence. We're going to dedicate two and actually 3 sessions to discuss scientific evidence, only because scientific evidence is more complex and complicated and requires more effort to use, right? Because understanding scientific evidence, what scientific evidence is trying to achieve, how it does that, and how it can be used, is more complicated. So we're going to spend three sessions, 3 weeks to discuss scientific evidence. In the last of these 3 weeks, we will be applying what we've learned in the first 2 weeks to your CAT. So in the third week from today, I will take you through the whole CAT exercise, right? The whole CAT report that you will be submitting. I will take you through each part of that report. So you can ask me questions about that. But that CAT will rely on what we do in the first 2 weeks starting today, right? So the agenda for today is first, because we didn't have class last week, I had put up a recording of last year's material, right? Last year's class relating to professional expertise, and also some slides. I'm hoping you guys have had a look at it, and if you have had a look at it, please ask me questions, because I want to just go through a few key aspects of professional expertise so that I'm clear that you understand that material and you don't have any doubts about any of that. And then once we're done with that, we will start with looking at scientific evidence, what we mean by scientific evidence, how it is important, how we should understand it, what it is trying to achieve, and look at different types of scientific research designs which will determine the quality of the scientific evidence that you're looking at, right? Not all scientific evidence is of the same quality. And so how are you to judge which which scientific study has been done well and has been done in a manner that will be persuasive or convincing? So we will start with that this week, looking at what scientific study we're trying to achieve. And then next week, focus on trying to evaluate scientific research. Right? What are the criteria by which we will judge scientific research? And then at the end of this today's session, we will look at acquiring scientific knowledge, scientific evidence. Right? How do you go about looking up the relevant scientific research, right? Relevant to your question. I have a feeling we may not get to that this week. That might carry over in the next week, acquiring scientific evidence, because I think the first part of it, trying to understand what scientific evidence is, it can sometimes take a while, right? I want to make sure that you understand that, and then acquiring scientific knowledge scientific evidence is a little easier, because it's just some suggestions on what sort of steps to take, and what sort of keywords to use to find the most relevant articles, journal articles, and so on. So that we can cover next week if we don't get to it this week. But I think it's important to do the important thing, important aspect of it, and spend some time on it. Before I get to professional experience, another reason why I'm not certain we'll get to acquiring scientific evidence this session is because I want to take you through the problem definition report again. Just because based on your questions, I want to make sure that you get your doubts. I have a sense of some of the key confusions you might have, and so I want to clarify those confusions. If you could just give me a second, I'll just pull it up from Wattle. So as I made you aware on Wattle, I have put up some samples of a sample problem definition report and a sample CAT, right, from one of my students last year. These are both excellent reports, so I wanted to show you these reports. But I also want to talk about some differences from what you guys will be doing. So see if this works. Yeah. So, first, the background, right? It gives you an idea of what the company is about and what outcome you're focusing on, right? I would recommend that you focus on one outcome, right? In the peacock, if you remember, O stood for outcome, right? What outcome are you interested in? So I would suggest focusing on a particular outcome, whether it's employee satisfaction, employee productivity, is it organizational profit, organizational market share, whatever the outcome is, focus on that and say a bit about that. So what is the company, what outcome is it focusing on? So let's say it's concerned that its employees are not satisfied, right? The employee satisfaction levels are dropping. So your outcome is employee satisfaction, right? Focus on that. It's concerned that its market share is dwindling. Focus on market share. But make clear that that's your outcome of interest. In the background, you also say a little bit about what its assumptions are, right? What does it assume are some of the causes of the problem, right? What are the causes of employee satisfaction dropping, or its market share dropping? What are some causes that they think could be behind the problem? Say a little bit also about the solutions they're considering. And maybe they're considering some HR initiatives that might help improve employee satisfaction. Maybe they're considering some competitive strategies that might help market share, improve market share. Talk about those, right, in the background itself. Talk about what those assumptions are or what those proposals are. Because our effort in this class is to first be clear about the problem, right? Second, surface our assumptions about that problem, right? What are our assumptions about possible causes of the problem? What are our possible solutions to the problem? What we think are possible solutions to the problem? So those are important to do first, right? Be clear about the problem, the outcome, and the assumptions behind those outcomes, right? Around those outcomes. And once you're clear about that, talk about questions you would ask to test your assumptions, right? That's the main aim of this particular report. What kind of questions will you ask to test your assumptions around a particular outcome or problem? Right? That's the main aim of this report. So make sure you clearly do that. Frame questions related to scientific evidence that will test your assumptions about a particular problem. So that's the simplest thing you have to, and that's the that's the main aim of your report. If you do that well, then you've done a good report and you will get good marks, right? So the background, what outcome you're focusing on, why that outcome is important, right? Why is it important to the company that it have a good market share? Because if it doesn't have a good market share, its profits, total profits will be lower, its profit margins will be lower because economy of scale will be lower, and therefore it wants to make sure that its market share is high enough. Right? So that's the reason why it wants to focus on market share. Right? Just something brief and clear in justification of the problem. So once you have that, questions so the way it was framed last year was questions to explore the problem, but essentially what you're trying to do is questions to test your assumptions about causes of the problem, right? So questions about the causes of the problem. What are the causes? What are the causes of low market share? Maybe maybe your competitors have improved their technology. You've not kept up with technology. Maybe you're just such a large company that you're not able to change fast enough, and so your market share is dwindling. Maybe customer preferences have changed, and so your market share is dwindling. Um, in this sample, the student is focused on high turnover rates, right, among employees. So say before I begin, so in last year, the students also had to ask questions related to professional expertise. This year you don't have to do that, so your job is easier than last year. You just have to focus on scientific evidence. So what are some questions you might ask of scientific evidence? Sorry. The student is focusing on the leadership style adopted by managers and its impact on turnover. I should just reduce it. Okay. I don't know what I did there. I don't think I did it. Okay, working. Yeah, fingers crossed. Yeah, I hate this. In the other class, I can't even use this because it's just anyway. So. What should I do? I don't even know where it's coming from. You know what? I think it's just a problem with the speakers because everything is on mute, so there shouldn't be any sounds. I guess we'll just have to bear with it for the duration of this class. I'll make sure technical staff come in and take a look at it. So I hope you guys can bear this this noise. Let me know if you have any problems, and we'll see if we can do something about it. So last year, the student focused on employee turnover, and so the question that the student asked is, what is known in the scientific literature about the impact of authentic leadership on entry and intermediate level turnover compared to poor leadership or other forms of leadership on in large organizations, right? So either poor leadership or autocratic leadership. So make sure your questions are of that format, right? What is known in the scientific literature about the impact of your intervention compared to whatever your comparison is on your outcome in the context of whatever your context is, right? Make sure all your questions are like that. Now the distinction, very important, a lot of you are not very sure about the distinction between the two types of questions, right? Causes and solutions. So the cause of the problem should be something that the company had not anticipated, or company is not intended to do, right? So maybe the culture that is developed in the company, or it has to do with the environment, right? So economic reasons. It could be something to do with what the competitors are doing. Maybe it's something to do with the age of the company, maybe the size of the company. Maybe cultural difference between, let's say, China and Australia, because it's a Chinese company trying to enter Australia. So those are external to the organization, right? So these are factors, or it could be level of employee satisfaction and its impact on employee productivity, right? So that is a factor. That's a cause of the problem of employee productivity, employee satisfaction. So that's a cause, but not a solution. Employee satisfaction, solutions would be practices or strategies that companies can use to improve employee satisfaction or improve employee productivity. Right? Maybe some HR initiatives or some kind of incentive system or some kind of broader company strategy that might improve employee productivity or improve employee satisfaction. So solutions have to do with things that companies can do. Right? Is the distinction clear in the two types? Do you have any questions? Yeah.
The questions on this sample are quite general.
Yeah.
But you raised these examples
Yeah.
such as competitors or some competitors are quite specific. So,
Right. So I would focus on I would focus on specific questions like this. What is the impact of authentic leadership compared to autocratic leadership on turnover? So that's very specific, right? So keep it as specific as that. Yeah? Yeah?
Do we actually need to do research for this assignment?
You don't have to, but if you have the time to do it, it might help, because that will, doing a search of the literature on a particular, say, outcome, particularly, let's say employee satisfaction, or the particular problem, will give you an idea of what sort of factors have been discussed in the literature, what sort of causes, or what sort of solutions have been considered in the literature. It will also give you a better idea of the terms to use. Right? Yeah.
With your research, is the company basically
Sorry?
for the background
Yeah.
of the companies that we make all the applications?
Yeah. Yeah.
How can we do research related to
So you don't have to do research specific to that company. The kind of research I'm talking about is looking up some of the scientific studies related to that subject. Right? That might help. There's no point in looking up any information on the company because you're not really studying that company. You're studying a broader problem. Any other questions, guys? Yeah. So can you speak a little louder? Guys, can I have your attention here? Because it's important that I clarify your doubts. So if someone is asking a question, it might be a question that might help you. So let's all pay attention. Yep.
Well, that it means that in the second diagram,
Yep.
the solution means I have with a specific solution like
Yep.
high salary,
Yep.
where we
Exactly.
include the employee satisfaction or not.
Yes.
But in the first diagram, there's only maybe some factors.
Yeah.
Maybe high salary, maybe the low leadership, some
Yeah.
of it. So the first is general, the second is specific, right?
Depends on what you mean by general. So it's something that could be external to the company, or it could be out of the company's direct control, or something that is the company did not anticipate. Right? Maybe it didn't realize that its levels of employee satisfaction were dropping. Right? It didn't. That's not what it intended to do. But that is a cause of. That may be one reason why its productivity is dropping. Right? So that's the cause of the. Let's say you're focusing on employee productivity. One cause of lower employee productivity is its employees are not satisfied. So if your first question would be what is known in the scientific literature about the impact of employee satisfaction on employee productivity? Because you're assuming that lower employee satisfaction will lead to lower productivity. But maybe that's not the case, right? So you want to test your assumption. So that's what you do first. Second, in terms of solutions, you could say if employee satisfaction does lead to reduced employee productivity, what are some solutions I could use? Maybe, let's say, what is known in the scientific literature about employee employee loyalty programs, right? It could be some kind of HR initiative that helps employees become better committed to the organization. What impact does that have? What is known in the scientific literature about those programs on employee productivity? Right? Because your assumption is because those programs will improve employee satisfaction, they will improve employee productivity. But you want to test that assumption, right? So your solutions could be related to your assumptions about the causes of the problem, right? Does that kind of make sense? Yeah. Yeah.
So for the justifications,
Yeah.
you start referring back to the question, like
Right.
why ask the question?
Just speak a little louder. Yeah.
So for the justifications, is
Yeah.
that referring back to the question, like you started?
Yeah, so that's the other thing. So this student has provided justification for each question, right? Which is good, but you don't have to do that exactly that way. You could just give me a few lines of justification before you write out those questions to justify why you're focusing on those questions. Right? Just a few lines to say, in terms of causes, I'm focusing on these causes because these are my assumptions. Right? I'm focusing on the impact of employee satisfaction and employee productivity because I'm assuming that satisfaction levels will help productivity in this way. Right? So just say a few words right in the beginning to indicate why you're focusing on these particular causes or these particular solutions. Yeah.
When we have an outcome, do we have a specific assumptions reason to that, or we can have a lot of assumptions, like different reasons to that? So do we explain that to explain one reason to the outcomes, or we can have a lot of assumptions?
Do you mean assumptions related to the outcome or assumptions related to the causes and solutions?
It's kind of like the outcomes for the question I ask.
Uh-huh.
So it's kind of if we talk about the satisfaction,
Yeah.
like job satisfaction, we have some more like poor leadership or something, or like
Yeah.
low salary. So
Right.
we're gonna focus on the poor leadership to the job satisfaction.
Yes.
Or I can have a lot of assumptions. So I read the question about each assumption.
So I would say, so in the background you have already talked about your main outcome of interest, right, which is employee satisfaction, right? Why do you think that's important, etc. Now when you're formulating Google questions, make your assumptions clear about the causes, right? You assume that employee satisfaction, these are the factors that are most important when it comes to employee satisfaction. These are the causes that you think are most important. Why? Briefly why, if you have the space to do that. And these are your assumptions about possible solutions to the problem of employee satisfaction.
So we could kind of explore multiple.
You could explore multiple solutions and multiple causes, but in your explanation, focus only on those causes and solutions that you are talking about in this report.
Those causes will be like factors. So means the questions will be like, what's the scientific research on the like job or leadership on the job satisfaction?
Yes.
And the second question will be like, what's the impact for salary?
Yeah, exactly. Yes.
So it'll be like several questions.
Yeah, but I mean, you could, yeah, so either you can follow what the student has done and give some sort of explanation for each question, or you could just combine them in one paragraph before you write out the questions. Either way, right? Yeah, does that kind of make sense? Or,
I think I'll write down.
okay, yeah, you can share it. Yeah. I'm not sure that I've understood the question. Yeah.
So 500 words.
Yes. Yeah.
So if we're thinking of broad topics like organizational culture,
Yeah.
would you prefer us to concentrate on a few sentences, let's say 500 words, maybe
A few examples.
a few, because the landscape is massive,
Yeah.
would you rather see a variety?
I would encourage focusing on one or two things, right? So focus on one outcome. So some outcome related to organizational culture, right? Focus on one company. Focus on one outcome. You could focus on one outcome, but focus on multiple causes, multiple solutions. right? I would say don't go beyond 2 or 3 causes and 2 or 3 solutions. Even just 2 would be fine. 2 causes, 2 solutions would be fine, because it's not the number. I want to know how well you're thinking about this, right? How critically you're thinking about your assumptions and how you're questioning those assumptions. How well you're formulating questions relevant to scientific evidence, right? So 2 each would be fine. Yeah. Okay, last question. Yeah.
You just mentioned about the surface assumption. Don't you get maybe the causes or the solutions to the problem? So I use this like a question and justification table to test it in my report. Do you mean like this way?
Sorry?
Do you mean
Yeah.
we just work in that way? We use like this table, like question and
Yeah, you could do this. This would be a good way to do it, because it makes everything very clear, right? Because you have a question, why are you focusing on this particular cause? Why are you focusing on this particular solution, right? What is your assumption behind that?
I see. So maybe for the causes, we have some to list the justification, and also for the solutions, we have
Yes. Yeah. Very briefly, just one line. Yeah, that would be fine. Yeah. And now this student, I don't think she's put up a peacock, so you don't have to do that, right? You don't have to present a peacock, but if you do, it would help me, or just because it gives me a better idea of how you're thinking about it, right? So you can put up a peacock. That would not count towards your word count. You could include it. That will not be part of your 500 words, right? Also, remember that your peacock will be different for each question. The outcome will be the same, but the intervention and the comparison might be different for each question, because you're focusing on a different intervention, a different factor, a different solution. Yeah? Yeah.
So,
Okay, that's the last one.
so when we're making a peacock table,
Yeah.
do we have to make that for each question?
Yes. Yeah. At least when you're thinking about it. You don't have to present all of them, or you could present all of them in one table, right? The interventions are this, comma, this, comma, this. Comparisons are this, comma, this, comma, this. But the outcome will be the same, right? Pretty much. All right. If you have any other questions, let me know, and I will answer them as soon as I can. Let's get down to today's topics. So I'll just do a brief recap of professional experience. If you have any questions, just put up your hand, and I will try and answer your question. So the first source of evidence that we're looking at is professional expertise, right? Who are professionals? They are people with experience in a particular area of business or organizations. Why do they have professional expertise? Is because they have developed this cumulative knowledge, right? Over the years that they've spent in that particular area, they have accumulated knowledge about what works, how things work, what is successful, what is effective in that area, right? It differs from personal intuition and judgment, right? It's slightly different. It involves personal intuition and judgment, but it comes from, the intuition comes from many years of experience in a particular area. Expertise is best developed through these 3 things, right? So if you're looking for a good expert, look for an expert who has had prolonged practice in an area, right? Who spent many years in a particular area, or area of work, let's say in HR, or it could be in a particular type of organization, let's say a large multinational corporation, or it could be in a particular country. Spend a lot of time in Australia, so they have experience in Australian conditions. So prolonged practice in some kind of area or region or type of work. Expertise is greater when that experience has been accumulated in highly controlled conditions and environments. What does that mean? When those conditions don't change very much, right? If let's say a person has 10 years of experience in Microsoft, right? In HR in Microsoft, they would be experts in the IT industry, HR experts in the IT industry, if conditions would have not changed very much, right? Because if the conditions have not changed very much, they're more likely to know what works, right? Over all those years, they have experienced knowledge and evidence, and they've seen so much about what works in that one kind of environment. On the other hand, if the environment has been changing rapidly, it's been frequently changing, you can't develop expertise, right? You spend 2 years trying to understand what works best in one kind of environment, and then 2 years later it's changed again. So all that knowledge is, that you'd accumulated in the first 2 years is gone. Now you have to restart. So if things are changing all the time, you're not accumulating as much expertise as you would if things are not changing that frequently, right? So better expertise is someone who has spent more years in a particular type of context that you're most interested in. Expertise is also greater if over those 10 years the person has been exposed to feedback, right? Has been in some way told whether they have done a good job or not, right? Because if they're in an environment, let's say they're in some kind of monopolistic company, right, that has no competitors. So let's say they're a marketing manager in a monopolistic company. There's only one company in that industry. They have no competitors. The marketing manager has not had much feedback because whatever he or she does will be successful because it's a monopoly. The competitor, the customers have to buy their product, or they're not going to find any other product. So that marketing manager may not actually use the best methods, may not use the best strategies, because they don't really have to make any changes. Whatever they've done has been successful because they've not faced the market. So some kind of feedback, whether it's a market feedback, or it could be, let's say, constant evaluations within the company, which has given them feedback about how they've performed, whether they've been effective in their job. So some kind of feedback mechanism that helps them learn what works and what doesn't work. Right? So experts are best when they have had prolonged practice in a controlled environment that doesn't change very much, and have faced feedback over the years that they've spent in this job or in a particular area. Yeah.
Don't you think that if you stay in the familiar content, you probably can't have enough ability to face the challenges? So
Yeah.
it's kind of like you probably you are used to that environment, and you probably really have a thinking routine, and you can't use that to another new environment to support that the expert.
So that's a good question, because the kind of expertise you're looking for is expertise in adaptability, right? So in that person, if a person has faced a lot of changing environments in the past, they will be good at adapting to new environments, right? So that's one kind of expertise. But they will not be necessarily be experts in any one of those environments, right? Because they spend 2 years in one kind of environment, right? There might be other people who spend 10 years in that one kind of environment. They spent 2 years in it, and then they've moved on to some other environments because the environment itself has changed. So they may not really know what works in, let's say, let's say the manager has had to move locations, or spent 10 years in HR at Microsoft, right? You would think that he or she is an expert in HR at Microsoft, but that person has moved from, say, Australia to China to India to Europe to America to Africa. So they've spent only two years in each of those regions. So they might be very good at adapting HR strategies to many different environments, but they would not be experts in the Australian context. They would not be experts in the Chinese context. They would not be experts in the Indian context, right? So they would have one kind of expertise, but they would not have expertise of another kind, right, in those areas. Does that make it clear?
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's the thing, right? That's the main point there. So going back to the idea of critical thinking, right, that we're going to follow through this course. The main concerns that you can address through professional expertise are descriptive, right? You will not go to a professional to test your assumptions about cause and effect. Why? Because the professional will be biased in their opinion. They will not, for cause and effect type answers, you need scientific evidence. You need to follow the scientific method to identify cause and effect relationships. And we'll talk about that. So you can ask professionals about what their opinion is on cause and effect, but you can't answer those questions effectively. But questions about of a descriptive nature, you're more likely to get convincing answers. What do we mean by descriptive questions? Questions about what is let's say, what is the level of employee satisfaction in a particular company? What is how does a performance evaluation system work in a particular company? You can ask them questions that help you understand how things are in a particular company or in a particular industry or in a particular country environment, whatever their expertise is on. So questions would be related to, how do things work in Australia? How do things work in China? How does this performance evaluation system, how effective is it likely to be? What in your opinion is the level of employee satisfaction in this company? To what degree do you think productivity is a problem in this company? Have you experienced this kind of problem in the past? What sort of solutions have been considered? So those are kinds of questions you can ask professional experts. You might find alternative answers. So different professionals might offer you different answers. Right? They might make different claims. How do you judge which of those claims is correct? You try and get some evidence on it, right? Maybe you ask more experts. The more experts you ask, you get a better idea of how many of them support which of those descriptions. The more experts support one type of description. So some people will say employee satisfaction is really low in this company. Some experts will say employee satisfaction is fine. You want to know how many experts say employee satisfaction is low. If more of them say it's low, then it's more likely to be low, right, in the description. How good is support for it? For that, you need to be able to critically appraise the evidence that you've got from these experts. One way to critically appraise it is to make sure that the expert that you're talking to does actually have the best quality expertise in that on that subject, right, in that area. Now, there are reasons for you to focus on professional experts. But a lot of companies focus too much and rather rely too much on professional expertise. Right? Managers think they've spent so many years in a particular area, they have all the knowledge necessary to make decisions. That they have all the knowledge to decide which strategy will work best. And that often is wrong, right? Why? We'll talk about why. Generally, research has found that professional expertise and professional experience does not correlate with job success. Just because you have many years of experience in a particular job doesn't mean that's going to lead you to greater success than other people who have less experience. Why might that be? One reason is maybe what is effective in a particular job might have changed over all those years. So what you have accumulated, what you thought was successful 5 years back is not really that effective today. So experience can lead you to those kinds of problems. Also, what you believe is true may not actually be true, even if it's been accumulated over 10 years. So, doesn't always correlate with success. Doesn't mean that it's not useful, right? The expertise of professionals can be used in conjunction with other sources of evidence. So let's look at some reasons why professional expertise can be limited in its use. Limitations of intuitive judgment. Intuitive judgment has its pitfalls. Part of that is the cognitive and social biases that we all have and that we use in forming opinions about something. Also, when you're talking to, say, one expert in the field, or let's say 5 experts in the field, there is a small n problem. What does that mean? It's a small numbers problem. These 5 people might have a very limited experience in that area. Just because they've spent 10 years in that area doesn't mean they've experienced all there is to experience. Right? Let's say this marketing manager or HR manager from Microsoft has spent 10 years in the industry, but their experience is only of a specific organization context, which is Microsoft. Right? They have not experienced everything there is to experience in the field of HR or marketing in the IT industry. Other companies have other types of experiences. There are other types of experiences in other countries. All of those have not been experienced by these 5 managers that you're talking to. So their opinion will be biased. Will be biased towards things that work in their environment. Right? So that's a small n problem. It's not representative of the opinion of all people. It's not representative of the conditions that actually exist across the industry or across a particular environment. Also, the evidence is idiosyncratic. Right? There's a difference between generalizable evidence and idiosyncratic evidence. Right? We talked about this. Generalizable evidence is evidence that applies to outside of sample. Right? So you are talking to 5 people. What they say applies outside of their context. That's generalizable to other contexts and other people, other organizations. Idiosyncratic evidence is something that applies only to that particular organization or applies only to the context of those professional experts. It will not apply to your organization, which is very different from their organization. So, professional expertise tends to be idiosyncratic. It tends to be based on their experience, right, which may not be generalizable to the experience of others in other types of situations. So let's look at some of these in greater detail. Limitations of intuitive judgment, bounded rationality. what is bounded rationality? Is something that we experience as people. We are rational people, right? We have certain goals, and we will take actions to try and meet those goals. But we are not profit maximizers. We are not utility maximizers. That we don't have all the information, and we don't have the ability. Our brains don't have the ability to process all this information to such an extent that we can, work like robots, right? We can't calculate the perfect solution to the problem. Right? We can't maximize the profit that we can make in a particular industry or environment. Why? Because one, we don't have all the information. We don't have the ability to process all the information, and we don't have the ability to make all those calculations necessary to maximize, in some abstract way, the profit. And we also have other constraints, right? We are social beings. We have relationships, and we care about other things. So we have bounded rationality. We do want to achieve our goals, and we will use rational means to achieve those goals. But our ability to do that is bounded. It's limited, right? So we are boundedly rational. We are limited in our ability to be rational. A lot of times we are irrational. We have biases. So we are boundedly rational. We also suffer from decision neglect. We tend to, when we're looking for solutions, we tend to look in a limited range of look at a limited range of options. Those options that we are aware of, for example, right, or options that make sense to us. Options that people tend to be using. It seems like it's a fashion, and so everybody's using it. We'll use it. We tend to be selective in giving attention to information around us. Right? We saw this in the first week, where I'd shown you this diagram about a diagram that shows how we process information. Managers process information that they're exposed to. They're very selective in what types of information they process and use in the process of making decisions. So, professional expertise, managerial decision making is very limited, and any kind of opinions based on decisions managers are making solely on decisions and information processed by individuals is going to be flawed, right, because of these limitations. Let's look at some of the cognitive biases that we all are prey to at some point or the other. Metacognitive bias is when you aren't aware of the limitations of your own thought processes. You're not aware of the limitations of your thinking. Right? You're not. A particular instance of that is the problem where people who have, let's say, lower thinking skills are more likely to think that they have high thinking skills. They're less aware of the limitations of their thinking. So often people who are extremely confident about their thought processes and about how successful they're likely to be in making decisions are actually the least likely to be successful. Because of the fact that they don't have the metacognitive skills, they are overconfident, they're more likely to be overconfident, and therefore more likely to be more likely to fail in decisions. Confirmation bias is when you focus on information or evidence that supports what you already think, right? Supports your existing opinion. So you only look for information that confirms your opinion. And we all tend to do that, right? We'll leave out, we'll sort of suppress information in our minds that questions your own assumptions, that questions your opinion, that doesn't support your opinion. That's confirmation bias. Availability bias is when you focus on information that's most available to you. So you're preparing for, let's say, a negotiation with someone. You focus on, you're trying to find information about the other company that you're negotiating with. You focus on a report that's lying on your table. May not be the most relevant information, but that's what's most available to you, and decisions you make based on that report might be wrong, right? Might be ineffective because you're focusing on information that's irrelevant. So that is often a problem because we don't have unlimited time. We are exposed to some bits of information, things we've heard from people, things we've read in the newspaper, things we've read in some book, or things we've read in some report. We base our decisions on that information. We don't go looking out to make sure that we've got all the relevant information to make that decision. Right? So availability bias is a problem. This bias is similar to looking for lost keys. If you lost your keys, you're looking under the lamp. Yeah, so it's it's like looking under the lamp for your lost keys, even though it's more likely that the keys are somewhere in the darkness somewhere. Right? So that's one problem. Patternicity problem. See, this problem, for example. So this is a cinnamon bun, right? But a lot of people think that's the face of Mother Teresa, right? You see patterns that don't actually exist. Right? That's patternicity, and that happens to us in all contexts. We think we see some pattern, and we assume that that pattern is true, when then that's not actually necessarily true in situations. Overconfidence bias is when you're overconfident about your own ability, right? There was a survey that asked Americans whether they thought that their driving skills, how good their driving skills were. And I forget the actual number, but about 60 to 70% of Americans thought their driving skills were above average. That's not possible, right? 60, 70% of people can't be above average, because the average then will have to be somewhere in the middle. Outcome bias is when you judge the quality of a decision once you've seen the outcome. Right? You say, look, oh, this was a good decision. Look, it's led to so much profit. It was a good decision. But you have to judge decisions based on the information that you had at that point. Right? It may have been a bad decision, but it's just pure luck that you got these good results. Right? Or it could have been might have been a good decision, but it was just bad luck that it led to such bad results. Right? So that's outcome bias. You're judging the quality of that decision based on the outcome. The outcome could have been pure chance, could have been pure luck. So that's one problem. Optimism bias is when you're over-optimistic about your own chances. You think, bad things are not going to happen to you. Good things are going to happen to you because bad things only happen to other people. Right? That's optimism bias. Overgeneralization, when you think that your experience or your opinions or your what you think is effective in your context can be applied to other contexts and other people as well. Right? Primacy and recency effects. When you remember, most remember information that was presented to you first. Recency effects are when you most remember information that was presented to you most recently. So let's say you're interviewing for a job. You are most likely to remember what the person you spoke to said first, right? The first impressions. Or the opposite, you're most likely to remember what they said last, just before leaving. Maybe they said something that you really didn't like, just as they were leaving the interview. You remember that most. You're forgetting most of the other stuff that they'd said. So that's recency effect. So both of these happen to us at different points in time. Right. So these are some examples of cognitive bias, and there are many others that we fall prey to at different points in time. These are reasons why we need to be aware of interpretations that might be incorrect, inaccurate, before we make decisions. Other types of biases, gender stereotypes, we all know what those are. Attribution bias or self-serving bias. This is when if you have been successful, you attribute that to your own qualities. Right? I've been successful because I'm such a clever person. If bad things happen to you, you say, "Oh, I'm a clever person, but I've just been out of luck. Conditions were really bad for me. If I'd had better conditions, I would have done a better job." You blame it on the conditions, but you do the opposite for other people. Right? If other people have been successful, you attribute that to their environment, and if they're failing, you attribute that to their own shortcoming. So that's attribution bias. False consensus effect is when you think that what you believe is what everybody believes. There's a consensus around what you believe. Similarity bias is when you want to associate with people that are similar to you. Right? It's also called I forget, the term will come to me, it's a sociological term, about how we tend to prefer to work with people that are similar to us, or deal with people that are similar to us, or become friends with people that are similar to us. Conformity and groupthink. We might conform to what the group thinks, even though we don't agree with it. If we're trying to conform to things that we don't actually make sense to us at an individual level. The halo effect is when we see some qualities in a person or an organization, and we transfer those qualities to other aspects of those individuals. So let's say we meet a good doctor. We assume they're also good husbands and they're good, good people and they're good friends because they're good doctors. Or you meet meet a person who's really friendly and very nice. You assume they're also good doctors. So you're taking one aspect of those people and you're using that to evaluate other aspects of that person or organization. So these are biases, again, more biases that we can fall prey to. Reasons why our judgment is limited, and you need to be aware of these limitations. Even after you know these problems, you're still likely to fall prey to them in actual situations. So metacognitive skills are about being aware of these limitations, your own limitations as you make these judgments, and the limitations of other professionals when they are forming their judgments, right? And informing you of their own opinions. Those opinions might be the result of some of these biases, right? So you need to be aware of some of these biases, potential biases. How do you mitigate these biases? Use an evidence-based approach where you combine many sources of evidence. So it's not that you shouldn't consult professional experts, because they might have some knowledge that is relevant to your decision, but you need to combine that and test those assumptions using other sources of evidence. Also, Bayesian thinking. Now, this is an approach to making sense of the world, right? That's more effective in some ways. Instead of saying I don't believe that paying people higher salaries will lead to higher productivity, you can say, I believe that higher compensation I have 75% confidence that paying higher salaries will not lead to greater success. Or I have framing it the other way, I'm 25% confident that paying people higher salaries will lead to higher productivity. So you don't have much confidence in it. Why is this useful? Because you can update this probability, right? You're saying there's a 25% probability that paying people higher salaries will lead to higher productivity. But I've spent that's what I thought earlier. I've spent 5 years in this area. What I've learned has led me to update my beliefs. Having seen what I've seen, I now think there's a 75% probability that paying people higher salaries will lead to productivity. So you're still not fully sure, but you are reasonably confident that it might work. So framing it in this way helps you understand the strength of your belief, right? It's not just about whether you believe it or not, not a binary thing. You have a sense of how strong your belief in that is. So it's about probability, right? Because you can never be sure that something is going to be true or whether something is not going to be true. You will always have some strength of belief in that particular idea, right? So this is an effective way to think about the success, what is effective and what is not likely to be effective. Generally, professional expertise, evidence from professional expertise tends to be qualitative. It's not quantitative. You're asking them for their opinion, asking them why they think what they do think. So it tends to be, you want to surface their assumptions in order to also be aware of their limitations, their biases. So it tends to be qualitative. It's usually not something that you can measure, which is one reason why it's difficult for you to use that in cause and effect kind of to answer cause and effect type of questions. Who do you ask? Right? Whom do you ask? Whom do you ask? You ask people who are experts in that field. How do you know they're experts in that field? Those 3 criteria that we talked about, right in the beginning. Right, in that particular area. So they should have credibility and dependability in that particular area. The more people you ask, the better, right? That helps you deal with that small n problem, the small numbers problem, a small sample problem. How do you acquire professional evidence? Unstructured, structured interviews. And I won't go into that because I've already mentioned what these mean, right, in the first class. Think about emic validity. What does that mean? Get into their heads, right? Try and understand what they might mean when they say something. Not what you think they mean, but what do they actually mean. Questionnaires could be open-ended or closed-ended. Open-ended questions are those where you allow the person to say what they want. Closed-ended questions are questions where the responses are limited. Rate this particular statement on a scale of 1 to 7. That's limited. True or false questions, yes or no questions. Those are closed-ended questions. How do you acquire all this data or information? Some methods. One is what's called the Delphi method, where it's an iterative process. You ask questions of a group of experts, then you circulate the answers to all of the experts. Based on each expert will then see what the other people have said. They might update their answers, and then the next round you ask for an updated opinion, and you have several rounds of opinion gathering, where at the end you're hoping that there will be some kind of convergence across the opinions, the professional experts, right, in their opinions. So it could go on, or you could set a limit to how many rounds you're going to have. Focus groups, where you ask people that you think would be the best experts in that field, so in that area. So you get them together, you talk to them about, let's say it's a product, you're trying to target it at a particular customer segment. You gather people from that segment together, they'll be experts, on those customers, the preferences of those customers. You show them your product, ask them what they think about it, and so on. Those are focus groups. Any questions, guys, about professional expertise? Okay, so we know the limitations of professional expertise. They might have assumptions that need to be tested. Right? How do you go about testing those assumptions? One important way to test assumptions, your assumptions, the assumption of others, is to use scientific evidence. Especially when it comes to opinions about or assumptions about cause and effect. What sort of strategy will lead to the best results? What are some of the factors that are causing problems in your organization? Answering those kinds of questions requires attention to scientific evidence. So first, you need to have an answerable causal question. You need to be aware of alternative causal explanations, right? Alternative answers to that particular answerable question that you put forward. Which of these alternative explanations is most correct? How do you judge that? By collecting evidence scientifically. Or if you're not a scientist yourself, going out and looking for scientific evidence on a particular topic, right? And then finally, you need to judge how good that evidence is, right? Because you have alternative explanations for that particular phenomenon. How do you judge which of those explanations is best? That explanation will be the best which has the highest quality evidence to back it up. How do you judge what is high quality? By critically appraising scientific evidence, by judging which of them is most trustworthy. And that's the topic of today's and next week's seminars. How do you judge whether scientific evidence is trustworthy? Let's look at the example that I discussed in week 2. Right? A company, Cisco, that had used scientific evidence to help it make a decision about mergers and acquisitions. Right? Let me refresh your memory of this particular example. So Cisco wanted to grow quickly. Right? It wanted to grow as a company. The method that it wanted to use was mergers and acquisitions. Right? Acquiring other companies or merging with other companies in its area. Now what it found was that most mergers and acquisitions tend to fail because it's a very difficult operation to do. Right? Trying to merge two very different types of organizations is usually not successful. Right? Usually it leads to break up or the two companies fail because they've been trying to merge their operations. So Cisco was not completely dissuaded. They said, okay, fine, that's what most companies experience, but are there conditions under which mergers and acquisitions can work? Right? There's variation. What is the experience of those 30% firms that have had successful merger and acquisition? Why have they been successful where others have failed? So they looked at the scientific evidence on that, right? What are the conditions under which mergers and acquisitions can be successful? They found that mergers and acquisitions between similarly sized companies rarely work. They found that when they are culturally different, it rarely works. When there is geographic distance, they are less likely to work. Based on this kind of evidence, they formulated strategies and an approach to merger and acquisition which was highly successful. Between 93 and 98, they acquired one firm per quarter, which is an astounding rate of acquisition, right? It's so difficult to do it, but they were able to do it. And in that time, they acquired 57 international companies. Right? That's a huge number of companies. Even if all of them are not successful, just their ability to do that is impressive. Right? So let's look at this particular example. Right? What was the research question and what was their peacock? let's think about this for 5 minutes. Let's think about the first bit. What was the research question? How would you formulate it when in terms of a cause and effect type question? I'm glad the speakers stopped making those noises. If anyone wants to take a stab at it, just put up your hand. How do you formulate the question that they were trying to answer? So this is similar to a problem statement, right? I explained what the company is about, what was its concern, what is its outcome, and what kind of solution it was trying to consider as a solution to its problem.
They have a huge, it's a big question.
Yes.
You can break it down into probably 10 different ones.
I guess.
Or
Take a stab at it.
Right, we've got 3 listed there.
Let's look at the broad question, and then we can move from there.
Yeah. So the broad question is what makes an acquisition work?
Okay, so how would you formulate a more specific question in the way that we've done in the past? What is known in the scientific literature about? So thinking about the peacock.
You can say about successful
Yeah.
acquisitions,
Okay.
but that's less broad.
Right. So how would you make it more specific? So think of it in terms of the.
Focus on particular characteristics of something, of the companies you're trying to acquire, or
So yeah. So you're looking at the conditions under which that would
you're
happen.
starting to specify your context.
Right. So even before we get to that, how can we be more specific in formulating the question? So can we be more precise? So what do we mean by success?
Right, that was going to be my next
Yeah,
question.
yeah. What do we mean by
I
success?
don't know. And then,
Yeah.
then your comparison is for
Right.
what
So let's.
you don't acquire them, what are you going to do? Just not acquire them. Well, that's you can't measure whether
Okay.
that's
Okay. So
success, you don't do it.
let's look at the peacock framework, right? Let's try and break it down. What's the population? No, Cisco is just this company, right?
It's the companies you're trying to acquire.
Or companies that acquire up
Yeah.
in some
Well,
way.
yes.
Whatever, however.
Let's say all companies. Well, companies, right? But not just companies that acquire, because you want to compare companies that acquire to companies that don't acquire, right? So the population would be all companies.
Well, if you, so, jumping ahead in the picture,
Yeah.
if the outcome, I think you mentioned was that the company needs to grow,
Yeah.
then the question is, the population could be both, or either companies that acquire companies or companies that don't,
Yeah.
and kind of feeding that down into, are you more likely to grow if you acquire or if you don't acquire?
Right. Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah. So let's look at my stab at it, right? So let's look at the peacock first, right? Population is all profit-oriented companies, right? Let's look at all profit-oriented companies. You're interested in organizational performance, right? That's how you define success. A merger will be success if it helps you improve profit or improve market share or some form of organizational performance. So you can say organizational performance, or you could focus on a specific type of organizational performance, say profit. But in that instance, it is not clear. It could be broader. It's fine, right? Because in the scientific literature, there are different ways in which organizational performance is measured. So you can say organizational performance. So you want organizational performance to be higher. You want to see the impact of a merger or acquisition on organizational performance compared to the status quo, which is not merging or acquiring a firm. Right? Does that make sense? That makes it clearer, right? That makes the problem clearer if you frame it this way. That tells you how you define success, right? Organizational performance, higher profit, higher market share. What do you want to see the impact of on organizational performance, merger or acquisition, compared to not having a merger or acquisition, right? Yeah.
I want to know why the population is not.
What would your population be then? If you could just speak a little louder so everyone can hear.
Maybe the two companies that will be merged, like with the CI.
Right.
So the subjects will be these two companies.
So you could do that. So you can say well, no, actually you can't. Now that I think about it, why? Because you want to see the impact of the merger and acquisition on the original company, right? You want to see the impact of it on Cisco, because Cisco wants to assess what would happen if it merged or acquired a company compared to if it did nothing, right? So population is companies like Cisco, right? Does that make sense? Because you want to see the impact of mergers and acquisitions on the performance of the original company, which is Cisco, right? So when you're looking at scientific studies, you want to make it broader. Not just Cisco, you want to look at companies like Cisco, right? Companies that like Cisco, some of which had mergers and acquisitions, some of which that didn't have mergers and acquisitions, right? Does that make sense? You want to compare them. So, yeah.
Can I regard the successful merger as an outcome and then I change the intervention to the different size differences or profit differences?
So we'll come to that. So that's the first part of the question, right? You could even frame it like this, right? So you're interested in the impact of mergers and acquisitions on organizational performance in the context of size differences, cultural differences, geographic distance, large multinational corporation in the US, right? So you're including the conditions in the context. And I'll show you how we can think about it in more clear terms, like in terms of relationships between variables, But if you, in the most simplest way, this would be the best way to sort of break it down. Does it make sense? So think of it this way, right? The question is, what is known in the scientific literature about the impact of merger and acquisitions on organizational performance in the context of size differences, or in the context of cultural differences, or in the context of geographic distance? Does it make better sense? Yeah? Right? Yeah.
So my question is about the population. So the population should be the companies like Cisco.
Yes.
So is the all-profit oriented organizations too large for Cisco?
That's up to you to decide, right? That's up to Cisco to decide. But it's also, I mean, as a researcher, it's a judgment call, right? It can. Cisco has to make that decision. They say, look, should we focus only on other IT companies, large IT companies? Let's say large multinational, so I didn't mention the industry context here. You can also include IT or networking companies, right? Large multinational IT companies. So you can focus on, the population could be all profit oriented, large multinational IT companies. It could be. But maybe that's too narrow. Maybe you can learn from other types of companies too. Maybe some of those other companies that are outside of the IT industry, that are not large multinationals, maybe their experience might also help you understand your own success, right? Your own ability to, so that's one thing, right? Maybe you can learn from companies that are slightly different. Maybe also there's not enough scientific evidence that has studied large multinational IT companies. So then you need to broaden it and look at other types of companies also. But when you do that, when you look at other companies also, be aware of the differences between those companies that have been studied and your own context. Right? Does that? So it is a judgment call. You wouldn't get less marks if you said population was all IT companies or all large IT companies. But then you need to think about the question slightly differently. And you need to think about the evidence slightly differently. And you need to be sure that there is enough evidence on that population, studying that population. Does that make sense?
So
Yep.
essentially we're using the peacock to break down your problem so you know what to search for.
Exactly.
So you might make a peacock up and then you go and do a search and say, oh, well,
Exactly.
I can't find any information
Exactly.
on
I need to modify my
A,
peacock.
In geographically different places, so I'll skip that one and add a different.
Exactly.
Or
Yes.
you have to do one.
Yeah. So your peacock might be evolving as you do your CAT, for example. When you acquire scientific evidence, you might say, look, I don't have enough information on large multinational corporations or the IT industry. I need to broaden it. So your population then becomes broader. So really you're using the peacock, as you said, to break down the problem and look for relevant information. Right? Your peacock determines what kind of evidence you're looking for. Yeah. Right. So, which is why your peacock essentially is your research question, right? It's just in different words, or different format. Your peacock essentially is the answerable question that you're looking for, and this is why you need it to be in this format, because that's what makes it answerable. That allows you to look for the relevant information. If you don't have this, you won't find the relevant information. You won't find it difficult to find information that's relevant to your question, because you don't know your question very clearly, right? Yeah, does this kind of make sense? So, I mean, there are different. I mean, you could use a slightly different peacock, but the broad format should be something like this, right? So this, right, should be thought of as relationships. If you are a scientist, right, you are going to look at it in terms of relationships between variables. So each of these things is a variable to you. Well, apart from the population, each of these things is a variable. And you want to find relationships between these variables. That's what scientific studies, the scientific studies that you're going to be looking at in your CAT, that you're going to go through them, you're going to read them and try and understand what they're saying, right? So you need to know what they're trying to achieve. What are they trying to achieve? They're trying to find relationships between these variables here. They're trying to find a relationship between this intervention, right, merger or acquisition, and its impact on organization performance. Right? Is the impact positive or is it negative compared to the status quo? Right? So if you were to measure it, maybe you would say, you would look at a population of organizations, right? And for each of those organizations, you would measure whether or not they had engaged in a merger and acquisition. And you would compare their performance, the performance of those organizations that had engaged in a merger or acquisition to the performance of companies that had not engaged in mergers and acquisitions. And you want to see which one is higher, right? The assumption is, in this case, that the companies that had engaged in merger and acquisitions have higher performance because they engaged in merger and acquisition. And the companies that had not engaged in, that had lower performance, rather had not engaged in merger and acquisitions, had lower performance because they had not engaged in lower merger or acquisition. So you are assuming that there is a causal relationship, right? So the first thing is a correlation. You're saying, as mergers and acquisition, if a company has merged or acquired a company, that particular fact is correlated with higher level of performance or a lower level of performance, in which case there's a negative relationship. If this is yes and this is higher, then it's a positive relationship, right? Having a merger acquisition leads to higher performance. If this is yes and this is lower, then it's a negative relationship. Having a merger acquisition leads to lower performance. It's a negative relationship. Does that make sense? So that's the first relationship that the researcher is interested in. Trying to find evidence, right, across many different, as many companies as possible. They want to compare as many companies as possible, see what their, and find relationship between whether they have merged or not to what their performance level is. Right? Larger the sample, the better the evidence will be, and we'll talk about why. Right? So that's the main concern. Trying to find evidence to estimate what this relationship is. Now, here we bring in the complication, right? We bring in the context. So, all right, so on average, mergers and acquisitions, let's say you want to see the impact of mergers and acquisitions on organizational performance. But you also want to see under what conditions they are likely to be more successful or less successful. So you want to see the relationship or the impact of these variables, right? Again, they're variables. Size difference is a variable. So, let's say you're considering 10 groups, 10 pairs of companies that are trying to merge. Some of them have a high size difference. They're very different sizes. Some of them are not very different from each other, right? So this is a variable because it varies across different companies. You want to see the impact of these differences on whether or not mergers and acquisitions are successful, right? So maybe when companies have a very different in terms of size, they will be more successful than companies that are that have a very small difference in size. So you want to test that. What did Cisco actually find? Is that it didn't do scientific studies itself. What did it do? It looked for scientific studies that have already been done by researchers, right, on this subject. And what did it find? It found that mergers and acquisitions generally have a negative relationship with organizational performance, right? It reduces organizational performance, right? It's a negative relationship. Yeah.
I just had a question on population. Like,
Yeah.
is it the immediate competition with the firm, or is it like all the firms in the industry or something?
Again, it depends really. So ideally, it would want to look only at its industry, right? Its competitors, because that would give you companies that are most similar to itself. It will be able to apply that information, that evidence most clearly. But maybe there's not that much, though maybe that context, that industry is not being studied in the scientific literature. Then maybe it needs to broaden its population and look at other companies as well, the experience of other companies. Include other companies in the sample. Does that make sense?
All the companies in general, like whatever there is in the industry.
Sorry?
Like all the firms in the industry, like we have to make comparison with them.
Yeah, either industry or even outside the industry, if there's not much scientific evidence on your industry. Right? Does that make sense? Yeah. So it depends. What your population is really depends on how much evidence there is on your companies that are similar to you, and whether you can actually learn from companies that are not exactly in your industry or not. So they found that it is a negative relationship, but if the mergers or acquisition is between different sized companies, the negative effect is weaker, which means it's more likely to be successful. Does that make sense? The main relationship, or main effect as they call it, is negative. But this particular variable, size difference, has a negative influence on this negative relationship, which means it has a positive relationship, positive influence. Does that make sense? It's double negatives, which means positive, right? When it reduces the negative effect of merger and acquisitions on organizational performance, it means it actually improves performance of mergers and acquisitions, right? Does that make sense? Some of it will sink in as you think about it, right? But I'd like you to go back home and look at this and think about it more carefully, right? If you have doubts in whether it makes sense to you, I'll tell you that it does make sense, because that's how it is, right? It is like that. You have to figure it out for yourself at home, right? Because some of this, as a PhD student, when I was, it took me a while to really let it settle into my brains, right? So there's no two ways about it. You have to go home and think about it for yourself, right? So this actually improves the performance of merger and acquisition. So it has a negative influence on the negative relationship here. Cultural differences, geographic distances, they reduce the success of merger and acquisition. So what do? They strengthen the negative relationship between merger and acquisitions, right? They make the negative relationship stronger. So they make it worse. They make what is already in a negative relationship, they make it worse. Geographic distance and cultural difference will make it worse, right? Does that make sense? So this is how a scientific researcher will think about this or this. This is what they are trying to answer. This is the question. What is the relationship between mergers and acquisitions and organizational performance? What is the influence of size differences, cultural differences, and geographic distance on this relationship? Does that make sense?
So just
Yeah.
when you're looking at your next diagram,
Yeah.
you're actually just considering one of those
Yes.
additional influences at a time.
At a time,
It's
yes.
not like
Well, you
the
could.
size difference and then also the culture.
Well,
I mean,
in actual fact, you might be including all of these variables at the same time. In fact, you should, because they're all also control variables, as we'll talk about them. But so in a statistical analysis, you will include all of these variables. You want to see the effect of all of these variables at the same time to be able to do the best job. I mean, there are complications, but in generally, yeah. Does this make sense? So this is how to think about any decision that you're trying to make. Break it down into your peacock, right? This is really the critical thinking process at work, right? Break it down, break down the problem. What is the outcome you're interested in? What sort of factors and solutions will influence that outcome? What sort of relationship do you think exists between those variables? How do you test those assumptions? Your assumptions about relationships between these variables.
Sorry, I can't understand your logic about this.
Okay.
And in my logic, I think if the difference of the size is
Yeah.
bigger,
Yeah.
and it's more like to field.
Right.
And if the cultural difference is bigger, it's more like to successful.
That's your logic. You think that if the cultural difference is bigger, companies will be more successful in merging or acquiring.
Yeah, if the difference of size is bigger, it's more like to field.
Fail.
Yeah.
Yeah.
If the cultural difference is smaller, it's more like to success. It's based on my
Yeah.
experience.
That's correct. So if the cultural difference is larger,
Yeah.
it's more likely to fail,
Yeah.
right? That's what I'm saying. Right. I mean, that's what Cisco has found. There's a, but size difference. Well, you need to look up the research on that. But basically, the idea is, if they're of similar size, right? They're competition, right? There's friction. They have similar systems. Well, not similar systems, but different systems, but trying to do the same thing, right? So it's more difficult to merge them.
Also, the leaders,
Yeah.
they are
Yeah, they might. Well, they don't have to be bigger. Even if they're smaller, but they're the same size, it's still more difficult to do them.
so the leaders of the two companies with the same size will
More likely to be more likely to be competitors. Yes. Then it's just partly, mostly because they're more competitors, it's difficult to merge them. But that's a different question. I mean, this is not a class about merger and acquisition. So that's something we need to think about. But the main idea is how you think about these relationships, right? Does it make sense? So what you said about cultural difference is exactly what is shown here. Higher cultural difference is more likely to lead to failure, right? Higher size difference is less likely to lead to failure. Right? Does that? I mean, that might be a better way to think about it. Greater size difference is less likely to lead to failure, right? Greater cultural difference, greater geographic distance is more likely to lead to failure. Yep. So this is what you will find in the scientific research. When you look at the scientific studies, they may not present it in this kind of diagram. Okay? Just be aware of that. Just because I've made it simple and presented in this diagram doesn't mean that's how the scientific studies that you will be looking at will present it. But you need to translate what you find there into this kind of a diagram to make sense of it, right in your head. Any questions about this? So these, what I've shown you here, these variables, they have certain names, these kinds of variables, right? So let's look at what these variables are called. First, What are variables? They're things that vary, right? And you want to see relationship between this variation. Variation in this, does it lead to less variation, or rather, reduction in this or increase in this, right? Variation in this, how is it related to variation in this? So that's what science is generally about. Now each of these variables have a name, kinds of variables. The outcome variable, right, in your peacock, what the outcome is the dependent variable. You want to see the impact of other variables on this variable. That's a dependent variable. The intervention and the comparison, they're both independent variables. Also called explanatory variables or predictor variables. They're called independent variables. You can call them, a simple name for it is independent variables. And this is the dependent variable. Because you're assuming that the independent variable causes the dependent variable. That's why it's called the dependent variable. Now, so you want to see the impact of this on this. This is the moderating variable that we discussed here. These are called moderating variables. Why are they called moderating variables? Because they moderate the relationship between the independent variable and the dependent variable. How do they moderate it? They either weaken it or strengthen it. Right? So in this case, the relationship between mergers and acquisitions and organizational performance is a negative one. Right? Size difference weakens that negative relationship. Cultural difference and geographic distance strengthen that negative relationship. That's why they're called moderating variables. So these moderating variables moderate the relationship between an independent variable or a dependent variable. Now what is this here? This is a new thing. I'm not showing you this. This is what's called a mediator, a mediating variable. What does it do? It sort of goes between the independent variable and the dependent variable. It's like a mechanism, right? It tells you how mergers and acquisitions might have a negative relationship with organizational performance. So let's say the problem with why merger and acquisitions lead to lower performance is because of, let's say, lower employee morale. Mergers and acquisitions lead to lower employee morale. So people are just very dissatisfied. They just lost morale. They just don't want to work for any of these companies anymore, right? Because there's so much tension and friction and there's so much to do. They don't see the point of it. Employee morale goes down, which is why the companies start failing. One reason why companies start failing. So you can test that assumption, right? How do you test that? By bringing another variable in here, which is employee morale. So how will you test it? You say, first try and see whether mergers and acquisitions lead to higher employee morale. And then you test whether a higher employee morale leads to lower performance. Right? So you're adding a variable in the relationship. Does it kind of make sense? Alright, so let's take a break, and when we come back, process some of this or maybe forget some of this and come back and try and remember it again. Oh, is it? But yes, you should mention what is known in this literature about the impact of the
more specific.
So yes.
In the job, I just like to achieve this. So, and do I have something?
Just why you think that just very briefly why you think demotivation might lead to demotivation. Just very briefly. Just a simple thing. Why you think it's important? Demotivation.
Sometimes while I'm doing this, I'm a little bit confused. These questions should be solution or
Yeah.
should in the case the company is already conducting some activities like provide incentives or get more motivation on leaders, but it doesn't work. It seems like it doesn't work. So if I just want to figure out this really works to motivate leaders. Okay. So let's put this discussion into the solution.
Yes, that's correct. That's correct.
Oh, yeah.
It is a solution because that's what the company trying to do to solve the problem.
Okay. All right.
Good luck.
I'm not quite clear about the mediator variable. What's the difference between these two?
So a mediator variable
It's
sort of goes
something
between.
I can add in.
Yeah, it goes between. So mergers and acquisitions reduce performance because they'll reduce morale.
I still cannot understand. So you mean the moderate variable that is something between? That
No,
can,
it doesn't come in between, but it either reduces or increases
yes,
the effect.
that is can moderate the relationship.
Yes, correct.
But when you come to the mediate
Yes.
variable, what's the difference between these two?
So a mediator doesn't reduce or increase, it causes the
It
relationship.
causes.
Yeah.
You mean the direct cause or just the indirect cause?
It's it's the direct cause. So
Direct
merger and
cause.
acquisition is the indirect cause. The direct cause is lower morale.
So you mean
So because
this one-
mergers and acquisitions reduce morale first, and because they reduce morale, they reduce performance.
I see. Let me repeat again.
Yeah.
And you mean for the moderate variable, is they have direct relationship. If this one increase, and this one will increase. But for the mediate variables, then maybe they have indirect relationships. Work like this way.
When there's a mediator, then the independent variable has an indirect effect on the dependent variable.
Another question is you just mentioned the Cisco combination. You include all the companies, maybe profit-oriented companies. But for my case, I want to do it for the geographic expansion. And if I search in the database, only but my case is for small business. For me, did I search for the large companies and also including the geographic expansion?
Yeah, you can.
I can.
Because yours is a small company, you're saying, can I include large? You can, but then if you do that, when you get the results, when you find the results, you interpret it differently. You say, look, this is what they find for large companies, but so I will take that, I will learn from that, but I need to be aware that the evidence might be slightly different for smaller companies.
Okay, but I have done the research before in the database. I found that when they relate to national companies, they offer for the bags, like their financial bags. But for me, I just want to focus on like fitness companies, maybe gym companies.
You can try and do that, but I would say for this course, focus on research that you can find. Maybe there's not enough on gym companies, so we can make it broader.
Yeah, so for me, I also can do some experiments, maybe for the financial industry.
You can, yeah, you can. But make sure you know. Then at the end of your CAT, you talk about why, because they're different. The evidence will also need to be
Yes, maybe the limitations.
considered different. Yes, the limitation of your evidence. Sure.
Early retirement. Yeah, early retirement because the big company wants to change the market.
Okay.
So basically, average 35 years old stay and below is get the early retirement to the company.
Yeah.
So when they get settled, then the company began to set new employees. This is generation Y.
Yeah.
So they select around 10 years of generations. And then the problem now, the company is the baby boomers have to retire because they're already pension age. And then the company is confused about giving the Gen Y the high positions.
Yeah.
That's what the most problem is. Probably conditions. So I read it because the leadership of Gen Y and the performance of the company. That's the goal. So I mean, something is population is the question is the general leadership because there's a generation. Conversations to the school because there's no.
Okay.
And then the outcome is organization performance.
Let me see.
Actually, I mean, that's very clear.
No, that's okay. No, I just want to see. Yeah, I guess you can focus on organization performance. So I'm wondering if you want to, instead of comparison being status quo, you can say leadership of other ages. You want to compare it with other
That's why the question is important.
Yeah, why is it? Or basically maybe why you want to focus on that cause or that solution, and why you assume that it has an impact on the organization performance. Very briefly. Yeah, sure. Yeah, sure. But you can absolutely student. Okay. Yeah, that's a good thing. Yeah, that's a good yeah, but tutors are important. So you could say student numbers could be thought of as maybe is a kind of measure of customer satisfaction. Yeah. So we can say. So the problem may be what is known in the scientific literature about tutor or teacher motivation on student performance or student absenteeism, right? And the solution may be something that will help improve teacher motivation. So this is good, but make sure that there's enough research on that. When you do the CAT, you don't have you don't suffer from you don't have to don't find enough research on that. I think there should be, if in education, research on education. you can find scientific studies on this, then this sounds fine. Yeah, you could think of this as management of schools, right? This is, you're trying to manage a school. This is also an organization. So it doesn't have to be a company. It can be a school, it can be a government department, any kind of organization. No, it doesn't. Yes. It can be a little bit over. A little bit more is okay. Right, I should begin in a minute. Good luck. Alright, I can only look at one per person. Either way, your choice. So you can, you made it up. Yeah, don't need references. Okay. Any impact of that on? Yeah, sure. So you can look at, So you can say, I would say first focus on one of these, right? So first look at causes of interpersonal conflict or working stress, right? And then think of narrow working place as a solution. So look at this as a solution. You want to ask solution question about this on an impact on one of these, but also look at other causes of working stress. These are the outcome. This is the outcome. No, attendance rate is the outcome, is it? Okay. Absolutely. So attendance rate attendance rate is the outcome. These are the causes, and this is the solution. Yeah, that's it. Yeah. These could be causes. No, you can have more than one of these. And you can have one solution, that's fine. Yes, these are the causes, and this is the solution. You have two types of questions, right? Cause questions and solution questions. So you can use this for the cause questions and this for the solution questions. Not counted. Yes. You don't have to give tables. You can just give the questions. And before the questions, you can say a few words about why focusing on interpersonal conflict. Yeah, that's okay. You don't need. Yeah, exactly. Only the justification. You don't need anywhere else. Okay. All right. I have to start class. Good luck. There was a problem with the speakers as well. Even when I muted everything, it was still like this.
Well, it might be up too loud.
No, it is, but it is muted.
Yeah, but if it's...
Yeah. No, is it? Yeah, from the speakers. No, I tried everything. I shut everything. No, it stopped now. But, sure. Oh no, I'm muted.
Is it muted?
I'm muted.
Oh yeah.
Oh, sorry.
Sorry, is there something you guys want to do?
Yeah, I just need to check something really quickly. Is it okay?
I have.
I won't put,
delete
I
only
won't,
one time.
I won't put that up on the.
Okay.
No worries.
I reckon the HDMI could be. I read, if you read the ticket, but he reckons sometimes when it's loose. Anyway, I'll have to check another time. Thank you.
Alright guys, so let's take this ad. So we've looked at what scientific studies are trying to do, right? They're trying to look at relationships between variables. Scientific evidence, basic idea is to test theories, right? Put forward theories about relationships between variables and test those theories, right? See whether they actually are true in the real world. According to philosopher of science Karl Popper, the scientific method involves falsification. What does falsification mean? Trying to find evidence to disprove theories or assumptions that people know. Which is why you need answerable questions. Questions that can be tested against. Sometimes the questions cannot be tested against questions. Generally, research in science happens in or is published in scientific journals, which are peer-reviewed journals. What is peer review? It's a process by which academics in a academic experts in a particular area or on a particular subject review and evaluate the work of others. Right? So you have, let's say, someone like me will submit their work. I've done a study looking at relationships between variables. I've done statistics, I've collected data, done analysis, and found that the relationships are of a particular kind. Right? I submit that. I write that up in a journal, in an article. I submit that to a journal for them to publish it. But they will send it to experts, right? Other experts, my colleagues in academia, who also know the subject. And the reviewers will tell the journal whether or not to publish it. But before they do that, they will send me some comments. They'll say, look, you need to make these changes to make the article better, right? Better quality, more trustworthy. There are many problems. There are many problems with this article. You need to do some additional analysis. You need to collect more data. You need to make some more arguments in order to make the article convincing. If you make these changes and it's convincing, then the journal will publish you. And so that's called a peer review process. My peers, who are other people in my field, evaluate my study. And then if they like it, if they agree with it, if they find it that it meets certain standards, scientific standards, then they will publish it. Right? So scientific studies go through that process, right? Which is why they tend to be more rigorous. Because my peers will be very critical of everything that I do. They will expect me to use the most appropriate methods to estimate causal relationships between variables. Which is why fields are done. Right? Most articles that are submitted to journals are not accepted. Most of them, especially in the top journals, they'd have 20% acceptance rate. They'll only accept 20% of the output that are submitted to them. So it feels like, your reviewers are bashing you. It does feel like I can tell you. So generally, what is the scientific method? Formulating theories about relationships, let's say between mergers and acquisitions and organization performance. Hypothesizing, so you convert those into hypotheses that can be tested. And then testing those hypotheses using evidence that has been analyzed, usually using statistics. Now, the key thing that we've been discussing so far is cause and effect. Right? The main thing that you're using scientific evidence for is to establish cause and effect relationships. Right? Cause and effect relationship between merger and acquisitions and organization performance. Cause and effect relationship between size differences, cultural difference, geographic distance, and the relationship between mergers and acquisitions and organization performance. So you want to see what is causing what, right? Now, that is the ideal kind of situation. You want to be able to understand cause and effect. A lot of what we know doesn't come from that kind of evidence, right? Evidence about cause and effect. It comes from association. Right? That's relatively weak evidence. What do we mean by association? It comes from seeing, observing. Right? What if I see, how would seeing X change my belief in Y? Right? Examples, what does seeing, what does a symptom tell you about me? So, I've been coughing a lot. Doesn't mean that I have a fever. Maybe I have a fever. Right? Because I observe myself coughing, I'm assuming that I have an infection or I'm going to get a fever. You do a survey. What does that survey tell you about the election result? That you're making an association. Right? You're making an assumption. This survey, people in the survey said that Donald Trump is going to win this election. You're making an assumption that will actually means that Donald Trump will win this election. Right? That's an association. But this is weak evidence. Right? You're making that assumption. You're not testing that assumption. The second level is when you actually intervene. You say, look, let me poke myself in my hand and see what happens. You're actually doing something. You're poking yourself and, blood comes out. You say, okay, so if I poke myself in my hand, blood's put aside. Right? There's going to be more blood coming out. If I poke myself in my heart, I'm going to die. Right? If I poke you in your heart, let's see what happens. You die. And presumably, if I poke you in your heart, you die. You're doing something, and then you watch the causal effect of it. Right? So that's better, right, than making association. Association is when you see something and you're assuming that has an effect on something. You don't actually see the cause in effect relation. With an intervention, you can actually see the cause and effect. Because you're doing something to cause something else. Example, if I take aspirin, my headache will be cured. So if you take an aspirin, you will know if your headache is cured. Right? You can actually find out. So you can actually do that experiment. So that's the next level of evidence. The third level of evidence is what's called counterfactual. It's a counterfactual question that you're trying to answer. What does that mean? You're asking what if. Right? What if I had not started smoking cigarettes? What if I had taken pill X rather than pill 1. You're trying to imagine what would happen if you had done something else compared to what you actually did. Right? Why is this a more complex question? Because often you can't go back and undo what you've done. So you're asking, what if I had not chosen, what if I had not started smoking cigarettes? The fact of the matter is that you had started smoking cigarettes. You can't go back and not start smoking cigarettes. Right? So how do you answer that question? How do you answer that question? How do you answer questions like that? Let's look at this simple question. Or let's say you're an organization. You want to ask, what if I had not acquired this company? Would I have had higher organizations? Would I have had higher profits? How would you answer that question?
What happened to other companies that did different things, particularly with the what that makes me think of is the statistical stuff. So in Kennedy v. Live, if we look at people in his age group, people's lifestyle factors go back how many of them are still alive at the moment, didn't get murdered. How would we like what's the statistical probability of something like that?
Yes. Yes. But when we're using statistics, what are we actually doing? So let's take a little step back. What are we actually doing? So what we're actually doing is this. So let's look at this question, right? What if our organization had merged with a similar sized organization? Would our profitability have been greater? Right? You merged with a different sized organization. You can't go back and have merged with a similar sized organization. Because you already done that. What if our organization does decide, or you can frame it, does decide, right? You have, at the moment, you have not decided to merge. But you want to assess what would happen if you do merge with the organization. You want to imagine what happened in the future. Problem with this is you can't go back in time to do it, right? Solution, what you're doing is actually comparing yourself. Right? You're comparing organizations that did engage with engage in a merger with other organizations that didn't. You can't go back in time, but maybe you can look at other organizations, compare those that did merge with those that didn't merge. Right? What's the problem with this? Yeah?
My opinion is something that there's only one variable and the other elements are all the same as the current situation.
Yeah, exactly. So that's the problem, right?
Yeah.
That is the problem with this. That's the problem with it, right? Because other organizations might be very different. Right? When you're comparing two organizations, they might be very different from each other. So it's not just that the difference between them is only not just that one of them or some of them have done mergers and acquisitions and others have not done mergers and acquisitions. There are also other differences between these groups. Some of them might be older organizations, larger organizations, they might be in different industries compared to the ones that have done mergers and acquisitions. So you don't know which of these differences is causing organizational performance to be either higher or lower between these two. Right? So how do you deal with that? First, look at what the problem actually is. Right? The problem is really of alternative explanations. Right? Let's say you're comparing two companies. One of them is making a profit of 20 million, the other is making a profit of 30 million. You want to understand what is causing this company to have higher performance. The one difference between them is mergers and acquisitions. This company engaged in a merger and acquisition, this one didn't. Right? So if you look only at this bit of information, this difference between them, you will say, oh, this one has a high performance because it did not engage in merger and acquisition. Right? But then when you dig a little deeper, you realize that there are actually more differences between these two companies. There are other differences, right? Which could explain the differences. So there are alternative explanations. What are some other alternative explanations? First, the size, difference in size. This is a larger company, which is why it has a higher profit. Another explanation is that this is an older company, therefore it has higher profit. Because it has more experience, it knows what's effective, it has a brand, it has customers. It's also more efficient, maybe. Product quality. Maybe this company has higher product quality. Its products are of a higher quality. Which is why this company makes more profit. So which of these is the correct explanation for this difference in profit? Maybe all of them together lead to this difference in profit. So maybe all of them are true, but you want to know how much of an impact this has on this compared to how much of an impact this has on this difference, how much of an impact this has on this difference, and how much of an impact this has on this difference. You can do that. You can actually, using statistical methods, if you have enough information, you have enough data, you can use statistics to estimate how much of an impact this difference has on this difference. How much impact this difference in size has on difference in profit. And similarly with the others. Actually, you will want to, first step is knowing what these alternative explanations are. What are the other factors that might explain this difference in performance? How do you rule out alternative explanations? The first method is what's called random assignment. Now, before you understand random assignment, let me ask you a question. If you were a chef, right? Imagine you're a chef. You've got a really popular dish. Right? Customers really love your dish. You want to add some special seasoning. Right? You add the seasoning once the dish is done. You just add the seasoning on. At the end, you want to try out a new seasoning that you've developed. You want to see whether it actually makes it tastier. Right? How would you do it? How would you judge whether this additional seasoning would make the dish tastier? Well, one thing you would do, so you're adding different kind of ingredients to the dish, right? You want to make sure that one way to do it is maybe separate the dish into two. Right? You're making the dish, you break it up into two portions. Add the seasoning to one and don't add it to the other. Right? You taste one and then you taste the other. Right? You see which one tastes best. Right? Whichever tastes best. But what if you've not mixed the ingredients properly? Right? Maybe you've not mixed the stew or the soup properly. And in one portion there's more carrot and in one portion there's more beetroot. Right? Then you can't really compare the two portions. Right? Because maybe The difference in taste is not because of the new seasoning, it's because one is more carrot and one is more wheat. Right? So how do you solve that problem? Make sure you mix it really well. Right? You make sure before you break it up into these two, make sure you mix it really well. And make sure there's enough equal amounts of carrot and beetroot in both pots. Right? And then you add this new seasoning in one in comparison. Right? That sounds like a sound practice, right? That's essentially what scientific researchers do with random samples. Right? That's how they do experiments. So let's say you want to see the effect of one variable. Let's say it is smoking of cigarettes, right? And compared to no smoking of cigarettes. You want to see the impact of smoking of cigarettes on stress levels. Right? How stressed the person is after they've smoked a cigarette compared to people who have not smoked a cigarette. Now, you have the same problem as the problem that the chef faced. Right? If you're breaking it up into two groups, right? Let's say one option is to break the people. You've got a sample of people, right? Let's say you really want to find out how cigarettes affect stress levels for everyone in the world. Right? That's your population of interest. Everyone in the world, all human beings. But you can't really do an experiment on all human beings. You can't get them and give some people cigarettes and don't give others cigarettes. But you can take a sample of people, right? You can call people together and ask them to be part of this experiment. Let's say 100 people. You break those 100 people up into groups of 2 groups of 50. Right? One group you give them cigarettes, the other group you don't give them cigarettes. And after a while, check their stress levels before, and compare that to their stress levels after. See what the difference is, and see if the difference is greater for people who have been giving cigarettes compared to those who are not being given cigarettes. That's one way to see the effect of cigarettes on people's stress levels. Problem with that, maybe the people you've given cigarettes are generally more stressed in life. Right? Maybe those are the people who have just preparing for an exam. And the people you've not given cigarettes to, they've finished their exam, they don't have their mood, they're on holiday. You will see differences in their stress levels, but maybe it's not because you're getting cigarettes. So, one way to do that is to stir the pot. Right? Make sure that you're randomly assigning people to both groups. It's like stirring the pot, right? So you stir it up and you randomly put them in these different groups. So in that way, it's more likely that both groups will have a similar set of people. There will be a similar number of women, there will be a similar number of men, there will be a similar number of young people, there will be a similar number of old people in both groups. Because you're kind of randomly assigning them. Every person, random assignment essentially involves, what it means is, every individual in this sample has an equal chance of being either in this group or in this group. Right? If it's not random assignment, then some, let's say men, will have more chance of being in this group than in this group. Or people who are taking exams will be more likely to be in this group than in this group. That's not random assignment. So each person does not have an equal chance of being in either of these groups. So randomization is like stirring the pot, right? Before you break them up into the two groups. So do you see how randomization can help you deal with alternative explanations? Because the only average difference between those two groups is the smoking cigarettes. The other differences are the same, keeping them the same. Right? So random assignment is the sort of gold standard by which scientific researchers try and rule out alternative explanations. Yeah. Yeah, so that's a different problem. Right? So that's a problem of, we'll get to that later, right? Trying to establish cause and effect. We'll get to that problem later. So maybe I shouldn't have mentioned that. So maybe let's assume you're not testing them before now. You're only looking at them now. And then we'll have this problem. Right? We'll talk about before and after later. So the best way to do it is random assignment. Now the problem with random assignment is that one problem with it is that you can't always do experiments. Let's say mergers and acquisitions. Right? You're trying to study the impact of mergers and acquisitions and organizations. Can you do an experiment to answer that question? You can't, right? You can't force one set of companies to engage in mergers and acquisitions and force another set of companies to not engage in mergers. You can't really do experiments when you're trying to answer that question. So what do? You observe, you use observational data. Right? You look at what actually is happening. The problem with that is you don't have random assignment. Right? You're not randomly assigning people to mergers and acquisitions compared to not mergers and acquisitions. Maybe there is a selection problem. What is a selection problem? Certain kinds of companies are more likely to choose mergers and acquisitions. Larger companies are more likely to engage in mergers and acquisitions. Smaller companies are less likely to engage in mergers and acquisitions. If that's the case, then the two groups are not similar. Right? They are not similar not just because they have not because of merger and acquisitions. They are also not similar because some of them are large and one group is predominantly small. So it could be the size difference that's causing the difference in organization, right? Like you saw in this case. So how do you deal with that? Control variables. Include all these variables in your analysis. Get evidence, information on each of these for each of the companies in your sample. Right? Get all that information about each company in your sample and then do the analysis, do a statistical analysis to see the relationship between all of these variables and profit. Statistics allows you to look at the effect, independent effect of each of these variables on that.
So that way you want to kind of keep the population really broad and then bring it down by the problem.
Bring it up, yes.
Yeah.
Exactly, because larger the sample, the better it is.
Yeah.
Because more representative it is.
Yeah, if you're looking at more stuff, you can always
Exactly.
down the
Then you can break
stuff
it.
here, then you can
Exactly. So does that make sense? So these are two ways in which you can try and rule out alternative explanations. Right? So, yeah, so coming to your point now, right? So another concept here is what's called statistical inference. What is this statistical inference? It means inferring from what you found for a sample, right? So let's say you're looking at 100 people, or 1,000 people, or 10,000 people, and you want to use what you find for those 10,000 people. You want to infer the truth for the larger population, which is everybody in the world. Right? That's statistical inference. What does that mean? What is the likelihood of what you found for this sample to be true for the larger population? Again, you can use statistics to judge that. How likely is it that what you found for this sample is true of the larger population? the statistical ways of doing it. And I won't go into those. This is not really class about statistics, but you should be aware of that problem. Right? Generally, like you said, larger the sample, more representative it is of the larger population, and more likely it is that what you find in the sample is true of the larger population. Right? Smaller the sample, less likely it is that that sample represents everybody in the world. And so less likely that what you find for the sample will be true for any individual. It might be true for those 100 people, but doesn't necessarily mean that it will be true for the 100 people, 6 billion people in the world. Because those 100 people likely to be, what you find for that will be very biased towards one type of people, or some, let's say 100 types of people, compared to 6 billion types. So, combining what you learned just now about cause and effect, right? Establishing cause and effect. These are 3 steps that you should keep in mind when you're trying to answer cause and effect like question. Right. So the first part of this today, what we did today, was trying to frame the question better, right? In terms of relationships between variables. Now we're trying to answer that question. This is what scientific studies that you will be looking at and reading for your CAT. This is what those studies are trying to do. Use these 3 steps to establish cause and effect. Use these 3 steps to measure what kind of cause and effect relationship those variables exist among those variables. So what are these steps? First, establish whether or not there is a correlation. What is the correlation? Correlation is basically a relationship between 2 variables. What is the relationship? If one goes up, the other goes up too. That's a positive correlation. Let's say if employee satisfaction goes up, employee productivity also goes up. It's a positive correlation. A negative correlation would be if, let's say, if use of cigarettes goes up, health goes down, and a person's health goes down. That's a negative correlation. So, higher cigarette use is negatively correlated with health. There's a negative correlation. So the first step in anything is to know what the correlation is. Right? In establishing. What is the problem with that? Why not stop there? Why not stop at correlation? Yeah. Exactly. So one thing if you look at all this stuff, you will see the statement, you will hear the statement very frequently. Correlation doesn't mean causation. Right? What does that mean? Just because, let's say, just because, let me take another example. Mergers and acquisitions. Right? Just because companies that are merging also have high performance, doesn't mean that mergers and acquisitions are causing high performance. There's a correlation, right? Correlation with merging and between merging and higher profits. But that doesn't mean that higher profits, more merging is leading to higher profits. Why? Because it could also be the other way around. Maybe it's because companies have higher profits that they are merging. Right? Maybe it's the other way around. Maybe it's because companies are making so much profit that they have the money and the funds and the confidence to also engage in mergers and acquisitions. That will explain the correlation. So even if it is profits that are leading to higher merger and acquisition, you will see the same positive correlation. Does that make sense? So that's called reverse causation. you are assuming that it's mergers and acquisitions that are causing high profits, but actually reverse correlation. It's the higher profits that are causing companies to engage in mergers and acquisitions. So that's the problem. You don't know which direction the causation is happening. Or it could be another third variable that's causing both. Right? So for example, let's say you think that there's a correlation between merging and higher performance. You think it's mergers that are causing, leading to higher performance. But it's actually a third variable. Maybe it is organizational size. Right? Larger companies are not only more likely to merge and acquire, they are also likely to have higher performance. So it's not merging or acquisition that's causing higher performance. It's something else, size, that's causing both mergers and acquisition. And that explains the correlation. Right? Does that make sense? So just showing correlation is not enough. You also need to show that one of the variables is actually causing the other variable. The main way you do that, right, main way to establish what is causing what, is to show that the cause came before the effect. So the merging came before the improvement in performance, keeping everything else the same. That's not easy to do, but which is why it's so difficult to publish scientific studies. It's not easy to do. The main problem is how do you get the data? You need to show that the mergers and acquisitions came first, and the increase in performance came later, keeping everything else the same. Right? Again, you could use statistical methods to do some of that, and I won't do it. But essentially, you need to be able to do that. You can also use research designs to achieve this. So you need research design where, like in the example I gave earlier, you test before and you test after. So that way, you can say, look, this is what it was before. Now, the change that has happened between this time and that time, the only change was one of them is given signals and the other was not. So the difference between time 1 and time 2, the only cause of that can be the signals. Right? So that way you can show that signals came before the reduction in stress. Or does that make sense? So you can use methods, research methods, to do that. Show that cause came before the effect. Now, when I say that, you also need to be aware of this post hoc ergo propter problem. Doesn't mean that just because it came first, it caused it. Right? There could be, like I said, it could be something else, a third factor that's actually causing both. Or causing something that you're not measuring. Or the other problem is maybe the first thing happened because the people were expecting the effect. So maybe the merger and acquisition may not be yeah, so maybe you sort of try and frequent, you hang out at a particular restaurant, and that makes it more likely for you to meet particular types of people. So you think that hanging out at that place is more likely to lead to meeting certain people, but it's actually because you expect to meet certain types of people that gets you to be in that place in the first place. So what is causing what? It's not very clear there. So take situations like this makes it complicated. So you need to be aware of problems like that. So first, make sure that there is a correlation. If there is a correlation, what is the causal relationship between the two variables? How many variables? Way to do that is to show that the cause came before the effect. In most cases, that would be enough to to establish that there is a causal relation. Third, rule out alternative information. As we saw, how do you do that? Try and do an experiment where you can randomly assign people to two groups. Right? You could do that in the lab, or you could do that in the field. Right? In some cases, it might be possible to give certain organizations or certain individuals certain treatment, and another set of organizations and individuals another type of treatment. I have done this kind of natural experiment kind of research in one of my papers, which is recently been published in Organization Science. If you can't do random assignment, use controlled variable to do that. There are also other methods that I won't mention, but if you are interested in, you can come to me. I can suggest books to you. I will also put up some additional resources on this stuff, because it does help to read more on this subject to understand it better. I will answer some of your doubts. So based on this, right? Based on these steps, 3 steps, we can decide whether a particular study, right? When you go out and acquire scientific studies for your gap, to answer your question, you need to judge whether the methods that you're using allow them to perform each of these steps. Because if the methods allow them to perform each of these steps, if they show correlation, if they show that cause precedes effect, and if they do a random assignment, for example, then that's a good study. That's a good, high quality, trustworthy study. Right? It shows cause and effect convincingly. So that methodological appropriateness is one way in which we evaluate scientific studies. Is the method appropriate for cause and effect estimation? How do you know whether it's appropriate? If it meets all of these different 3 steps. And I will discuss in next week's class which kind of research designs will help meet these 3 steps, and which kind of research design will not meet these standards, meet these steps. If a study is methodologically appropriate, right, if it meets these 3 steps, then it has internal validity. The extent to which you can show that the IV is causing the AV, like one variable is causing the other variable within your sample. So whatever they're showing is true for your sample, for the sample that they are using. That means internal validity. It's valid. Those findings, their finding that X causes Y is true, or very likely true, right, to a high probability within the sample that they are using. That's internal validity. You also need to evaluate these studies for what's called methodological quality. There are 2 aspects to this. First, whether the measures that they're using are accurate. That you're actually measuring customer satisfaction. Are they actually accurately measuring employee satisfaction? Are they accurately measuring organization performance? If they're not, then the results that they find are less believable. They're less accurate. Not as high quality. Second, sampling and external validity. What kind of sample are they using? It might be that they are showing internal validity, right? So whatever they find, they're meeting these 3 steps, and what they find is true for the sample that they're using. But is that sample representative of the larger population? If it's not, then they don't have external validity. It's valid for those 100 individuals, or 1,000 individuals, or 1,000 organizations. It cannot be applied to the rest of the world, or the rest of your population, whatever the population. So that's the external validity. Does the study have external validity? I want to do this now. We leave this for next week because it actually is also more appropriate for next week because we're looking at critical appraisal of studies. We talk about different types of research designs and how those research designs, whether